Sunday morning at 7:55 a.m. on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack was decisive. Some 350 Japanese aircraft sank or were badly damaged, including 18 U.S. Navy vessels, 8 battleships, and 340 U.S. aircraft. 2,403 men and 68 civilians were killed. The attack lasted a harrowing 75 minutes. In 1941, Pearl Harbor was the main base for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. There were more multiple targets hit by the Japanese. Battleship Row felt the brunt of the attack. The USS Arizona would lose 1,177 officers and crewmen. The USS Arizona Memorial, dedicated in 1962, would be a shrine devoted to all those who died during the attack. On December 8, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress to deliver a short but memorable speech. In it, he declared December 7, 1941, to be a day that would live in infamy. Congress followed with a vote declaring war against the Empire of Japan. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, many Americans feared another attack. War had now cast its shadow over the country. An atmosphere developed of distrust and prejudice in parts of the United States against Japanese Americans, especially in Hawaii and the West Coast. The Yellow Peril was a term used by anti-Japanese agitators, pushing the narrative that all residents of Japanese descent were a threat to our national security. FBI head J. Edgar Hoover told President Roosevelt that the Bureau had been monitoring Japanese American activity before the war broke out. He did not recommend any mass arrests of Japanese. U.S. Attorney General Francis Biddle also warned President Roosevelt that the forced removal of American citizens was unconstitutional, and he further emphasized that no move to detain citizens descending from other European nations, such as Germany or Italy, had ever been suggested. Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, Western Defense Commander, went to Washington, D.C. to push for interning the Japanese. He described the Japanese as an enemy race and stated, "A Jap is a Jap. You could not prove loyalty." On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This order authorized the forced removal of all persons deemed a national security from West Coast to relocation centers, resulting in the incarceration of Japanese Americans. The President also created the WRA, or War Relocation Authority. This agency was created in 1942 to care for the Japanese Americans who would be removed from the West Coast, built and operated a network of camps, and implemented a controversial loyalty program. Following this decision, the West Coast would be divided into military zones. Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt became the Western Defense Commander. He first encouraged voluntary evacuations by Japanese Americans, but on March 29, 1942, under authorization of Roosevelt's executive order, DeWitt issued Public Proclamation No. 4, which began forced evacuations of Japanese American West Coast residents on a 48-hour notice. At this time, the West Coast agricultural industry was dominated by Japanese farmers. The Japanese produced 95% of California's strawberries, and the Pacific Coast was responsible for 70% of greenhouse flowers and 40% of commercial vegetables. Many Japanese farmers felt the evacuations were an excuse by other farmers and politicians to take over their properties. Lieutenant General Delos C. Emmons, military governor of the territory of Hawaii, established martial law after the attack on Pearl Harbor. He would also challenge the allegations of sabotage and is credited with preventing plans for mass forced removal of Japanese residents. Since 37% of Hawaii's residents were of Japanese descent, removing them from Hawaii would cause logistic obstacles, cost and labor shortages, and their removal would have destroyed the island's economy. On December 21, 1941, Emmons made a radio announcement to the people of Hawaii. There is no intention or desire on the part of the federal authorities to operate mass concentration camps. While we have been subjected to a serious attack by a ruthless and treacherous enemy, we must remember that this is America, and we must do things the American way. We must distinguish between loyalty and disloyalty among our people. There would be one relocation center on the island of Oahu. At this time, 160,000 Japanese Americans were living in Hawaii. By the end of the war, only 2,000 were interred. But over the next 6 months, the forced evacuations back on the West Coast would see over 122,000 men, women, and children be forcibly moved to assembly centers and then evacuated and permanently confined to a relocation center, commonly referred to as internment camps. Nearly 70,000 of these evacuees were American citizens. The internees of the West Coast never received the chance to contest the evacuation order. They were not compensated for their lost property or income. The speedy evacuation forced many homeowners and businessmen to sell out quickly. The total property loss of these residents is estimated at $1.3 billion. During the entire war, only 10 people were convicted of spying for Japan, and all of them were Caucasian. In the early part of the 20th century, many Japanese males immigrated to North America. These Japanese immigrants are referred to as the Issei, the first generation to immigrate. One of these Issei immigrants was Sadanobu Inashima. Born in 1886 in Shiga-ken, Japan, he would first arrive in Vancouver, British Columbia in 1906, where he worked in a sawmill for 2 years. Shortly after, in 1908, he moved on to Seattle, Washington, where he began work in the lumber mills and shipyards during World War I. His plan was to stay until he saved enough money to return to Japan and marry Suzuko Igawa in 1918. By 1930, Sadanobu and Suzuko were living in Seattle with their 4 children. They had 2 sons, Minoru David, Osamu James, and 2 daughters, Shieku and Fumiko. Their American-born children, the second-generation Japanese, are referred to as the Nisei. Unlike many of the Issei who came to America, Sadanobu Inashima was not a farmer. He became a businessman working in a hotel for 15 years, and then owning and operating a men's clothing store on Jackson Street in Japantown in the south side of Seattle. Soon, business was thriving in this racially mixed neighborhood where the Inashima children would both attend school and report to work. This would all change on December 7, 1941. Osamu James Inashima was born in Seattle in 1922. He graduated from high school in 1940 and then went to work for a year at the Civilian Conservation Corps. His goal was to experience something different that went beyond his familiar neighborhood. He was interested in meeting people from diverse backgrounds. After completing his time at the CCC, he began his freshman year at the University of Washington in 1941 as a pre-med student. His family's idyllic life in Seattle would never be the same as he recalls the morning of December 7th.
In August, I just got back from the Civilian Conservation Corps, and I just started University of Washington as a pre-med student. And so December 7th, I was delivering Sunday paper, and Sunday morning when I was delivering, I heard all about that. When everybody got excited, I wanted to know what was happening, and they said, well, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, we're at war, so that was it.
That was it. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
And how did you hear about that?
Well, of course, I had a mixed feeling. I knew that we're going to be in trouble because Japanese Americans and so forth. But then I figured that we had no choice but to be American. That I was born and never knew Japan, so this is my country and this is my citizenship. So that I have to. That's my obligation to do what I can for America during the war.
Following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the future of Japanese Americans living on the West Coast was uncertain at best. Politicians spread fear of the Yellow Peril. Talk of relocation camps were given broad coverage on the radio and in the newspapers.
What did your mother and father think being born in Japan?
Well, they said, well, you're a citizen of the United States, so you have to be loyal to the United States. And that's the tradition of Japan from way back during the samurai period. If the samurai went and became employed by another baron, then he had to be loyal to the employee rather to the family. That's the old tradition, yes.
The family's seemingly calm response to possible relocation followed the virtues of Bushido, a code of honor focusing on compassion, honesty, and sincerity, duty and loyalty, honor, politeness, integrity, and heroic courage, and developed by the Japanese samurai. Jim and his family followed these principles.
Were your mother and father American citizens?
No, they weren't allowed to be American citizens. There was an exclusion act, and so that they were not allowed to become citizens, and that was the irony. During the war, they said you were here for so many years and you never became citizen. But then they didn't tell you that they can't become citizens because they weren't allowed to become citizens.
That's right. They worked it the way they wanted to do, I guess.
Yeah. But they became citizens after the war when they were allowed to become citizens, yeah.
The decision was made in February 1942 by the War Department to create 12 restricted zones along the Pacific coast and established night curfews. The decision of relocation was also decided when the War Relocation Authority was established in March of 1942. Its mission was to take all people with at least 1/16 Japanese descent into custody. The United States Census Bureau would assist in locating Japanese residents. As their outcomes were being decided, Japanese families waited to carry on with their daily life. When relocation time came, many Japanese were forced to sell their businesses, farms, and properties for whatever money they could get. They would have only 10 days to settle their affairs. Jim's father was forced to sell their home and clothing store. As they prepared to move, they were told they could only take with them bedding, linens, extra clothing, and toilet articles, whatever they could fit into one suitcase. The journey began for the Inashima family in June 1942, when they were put on a bus headed to the assembly camp at the Puyallup Fairgrounds in Seattle.
And when did you evacuate your family?
I think we evacuated around June, yeah.
Of 1942?
Yeah.
How did your mother and father deal with it, and how old were they at this time?
Well, I think my father was about 50, something like that, and my mother was about the same age, yeah. And, well, they take it as it comes. Well, no, we sort of took factors. The Japanese saying "shikata ga nai," I mean, you can't help it, you know.
Yes, I saw that shikata ga nai, G-A-N-N-A-I, right? Ganai.
Yeah, shikata ga nai.
It cannot be helped.
Yeah, it can't be helped, and we'll take it as it comes, you know. So that's the philosophy he had. And then, well, first of all, we had about 10 days or so to finish our affairs, and then they took us to assembly camp first, which was in the fairgrounds in Puyallup, Washington.
Those are temporary camps,
Yeah,
correct?
yeah, temporary camp. We were there about 2 months.
Are they called civilian assembly camps? Is that what they were called?
Assembly camp, yes. We were lucky. We were in the sort of newly built sort of a barrack-like. What some of the unfortunate ones they fixed up the horse stalls and so forth, and they had to stay in those. But our family was lucky in that we were in relatively freshly built buildings. But
The Inashima family boarded a train 2 months later in 1942 and headed for the Minidoka War Relocation Camp in Hunt, Idaho. They settled in their temporary home, listed as family number 11881, a number the Inashima family would never forget. In an ironic twist of fate, Minoru David Inashima, James's older brother, would not join his family in the internment camp. The 22-year-old had been drafted into the Army in March of 1942. The Minidoka camp was one of 10 isolated war relocation centers established throughout the states of Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Idaho, Utah, and Wyoming. Minidoka was a 33,000-acre site with over 600 buildings, holding incarcerees from Washington, Oregon, and Alaska. The barracks were crudely and swiftly constructed, and not many completed before the internees arrived in 1942. The camps consisted of barracks wrapped in tar paper, hedged with a guard tower and barbed wire fences. The living quarters were approximately 15 by 10 and separated by walls that did not reach the ceiling. The camp had communal toilets and showers along with a shared dining hall. Each family member was provided a cot and no other furniture. Among the 120,000 Japanese held in camps during World War II, over half were children and young adults. These children attended the War Relocation Authorization Schools. By September of 1942, James and his father Sadanabu were allowed to work outside the camp, assisting local farmers harvesting the sugar beet crops. They were city folks, and the work was too difficult for his father, so eventually he would find work at a Chinese restaurant in Pocatello, Idaho, washing dishes. These jobs provided much-needed income for the future of their family. While the United States did not announce the gradual closing of internment camps until December 18, 1944, government officials quickly realized that the threat was minimal, and they began to allow internees to find work outside of the camps and attend college. James entered Idaho State College. Here he enrolled as a pharmacy student, since there were no pre-med courses available. While at college, he was able to take residence in a dorm room. In an ironic twist, his tuition was free, because he was now a resident of Idaho. His sister, Shieko, would also leave becoming a nurse cadet and studying at New York University. Each member of the family was discharged on different dates in 1943. Jim's mother, Suzuko, was the last to be discharged. Sadanabu had saved enough money for a down payment to buy the Dearborn Hotel in Pocatello. It allowed Suzuko Inashima the necessary residency for her to be released from the camp. It was in Pocatello, Idaho, that James's parents would build their new life after the war. The Minidoka camp held over 13,000 Japanese internees from 1942 until 1944. All relocation centers would be officially closed March 1946. During the war, Japanese Americans protested their treatment and wanted to be recognized as loyal Americans. Many Nisei would demonstrate their patriotism by enlisting in the armed forces. 2 all-Nisei regiments were formed during World War II. First was the 100th Infantry Battalion of Hawaii. The 100th saw heavy combat in Italy in September of 1943 and earned the nickname the Purple Heart Battalion. The 442nd Infantry Battalion would later merge with the 100th, It included 1,500 volunteers from Japanese internment camps. In 1944, the 442nd saw horrific combat in Italy, southern France, and Germany. The 442nd was the most decorated regiment in the United States history for its size and length of service. These two regiments combined to earn over 18,000 awards in less than 2 years, including 4,000 Purple Hearts and 4,000 Bronze Stars. In the Pacific Theater, the Nisei linguists were a critical part of the MIS, Military Intelligence Service. Their work was kept secret during the war. They served in every major battle against the Japanese, providing vital intelligence services, such as decoding military orders, translating enemy documents, and interrogating prisoners of war. After the war, the MIS Nisei were picked for critical assignments during the occupation of Japan. 2 of those Nisei linguists were Minoru David and Osamu James Inashima. In 1941, the military began a search for speakers of Japanese. A survey of 3,700 Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, found that only 3% were fluent in Japanese, and 4% were proficient, and 3% could speak it with training. The Inashima brothers qualified for this intense program. David was already in the Army in 1942, while his family was in the internment camp in Idaho. He completed the MIS Language Intelligence School in December of 1942 and was assigned to General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Sydney, Australia. He accompanied MacArthur when he returned to the Philippines in October of 1944. At the end of the war, he followed MacArthur to Japan, serving as a translator and interpreter assigned to the occupation forces. After leaving active duty, he continued his service in the U.S. Army Reserve Medical Service Corps and retired as a lieutenant colonel. Osamu James Inashima was drafted in August of 1944. He was first assigned to the infantry, but was soon transferred to Camp Savage in Savage, Minnesota. This was the site of the U.S. Military Intelligence Language School. These Nisei linguists would be required to not only speak conversational Japanese, but know Japanese military codes, techniques, slang, and battle tactics.
Now, you go into the service in 1944, and you are in the military intelligence?
Military Intelligence Service, yes.
Now, how did that happen? How did you get
Because,
classified?
well, they classified, they asked me whether I could speak a little Japanese and write. So they said, we need linguists and people that could interpret. Right away, they diverted me from the infantry to the military intelligence service. There was about roughly 6,000 Japanese American in the military intelligence service. Yes. Most of us were in detached service in small groups, so usually not more than about 20 or so in a group that went to different battalion, different army. We were lent. Some of us were lent to the British armies and Australian armies, and they even I knew several people that were served with the Chinese army.
Really?
Yeah. So I got to Manila August, and of course, about middle of August, the war was declared over. Mm-hmm. So the most I did at the Philippines was to talk to prisoners of war, especially, or the work battalion that was forced to work in the Philippines, and the job was to talk and see where they came from and to try to get them back home.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Are you talking mostly about Filipino workers? Or?
No, this was forced labor workers from Formosa and Korea and stuff like that. Yeah.
Different Asian countries.
Yeah. The common language was the Japanese. They could speak Japanese, so I can speak, and we were able to talk to them.
Jim would serve 9 months with the occupied forces in Japan from 1945 to 1946. He would see the after effects of the atomic bomb on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
The atomic bomb is, I guess it was a necessary evil. Bad, but then again, the alternative would have been an invasion of Japan, which means that I would have gone on to the invasion. But because of the bomb, that war was declared over, and that spared me from going into the invasion. So that's something that to think about, but it's a mixed feeling. I feel that it was a terrible thing for people to be destroyed by atomic bombs, and yet the same thing is that if the invasion took place, there would have been much more casualties, I suppose, yeah. Except it would be a different type of casualty, instead of atomic disaster, it would have been more or less artillery and bullets and so forth.
Still be bombing though, too.
Yeah, bombing, yeah.
After his active service in the Army in 1946, he continued to serve in the Army Reserves as a lieutenant in the Medical Service Corps. Jim returned to Pocatello to further his studies and would go on to get his Master of Science degree from the Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia in pharmacology. Jim returned to Idaho in 1951 and married Mary Estuco Shigita. Mary was born in Seattle and attended the same high school as Jim. Her family was also evacuated in 1942 and sent to Minidoka. Mary had a longer stay in the camp than Jim, but would leave to attend college in Kentucky in 1944. After the wedding, they returned to Philadelphia, and Jim worked on his thesis for his doctorate, along with working on the staff of the pharmacology department at Jefferson College. In 1954, Jim was offered a full professorship and chairmanship of the biological sciences at the New England College of Pharmacy, which later merged with Northeastern University. At the same time, the Inashimas moved to Woburn, where they raised their children Cindy, John Harvey, and Jamie. They became long-standing members of the First Congregation Church, first joining in 1955. Jim dedicated himself as a trustee, sung in the choir, and was instrumental in the listing of the church on the National Historic Register in 1992. He would also serve on the Woburn, Massachusetts Cultural Council. Upon his retirement from Northeastern, he was honored by naming the O. James Inashima Scholarship Fund in his name in recognition of his 35 years in teaching and building the school's scholarship program. Nearly 40 years later, during the Reagan-Bush years, Congress moved toward the passage of the Civil Liberties Act in 1988, which acknowledged the injustice of the internment camps, apologized for it, and provided $20,000 to each person surviving the incarceration camps as a means of reparation. The Inashimas donated their checks to various educational charities. The Congressional Gold Medal and the Presidential Medal of Freedom are the highest civilian awards in the United States. The Congressional Medal is bestowed on persons who have performed an achievement that has had an impact on American history and culture that is likely to be recognized as a major achievement in the recipient's field long after the achievement. On May 5, 2010, the Congressional Gold Medal was awarded to the Japanese veterans, including Osamu James Inashima, who served in the Military Intelligence Service during World War II.
This is the Congressional Gold Medal that awarded to the Japanese American soldiers that served in the 442nd, 100th Battalion, and the MIS for their service during the war. And this is the gold medal that the first gold medal was given to George Washington, so it's quite an honor.
Osamu James Inashima was a true gentleman and family man. He showed great dignity and kindness to everyone he touched, always living up to the Japanese samurai traditions. Dr. Osamu James Inashima died in 2015. While Europe was engaged in World War II, the United States in 1939 was remaining neutral and opposed to joining the war, but future war clouds were mounting, and 88% of Americans at that time wanted to assist the British. Therefore, as the specter of war approached, the increase in military manpower was urgently needed. All Americans would be needed, but at this time the military was segregated. Black Americans could join the military, but be assigned to all black units. The War Department created the Civilian Pilot Training Program in 1939. This federally funded and segregated program allowed black Americans, including those already in the military, to train on combat aircraft. On January 16, 1941, the Secretary of the Army authorized the formation of the all-black 99th Pursuit Squadron. This was the first step in the Tuskegee experiment. While still segregated, black Americans could serve their country as combat airmen. As a prelude to the site selection for the Civilian Pilot Training Program, Eleanor Roosevelt, a longtime supporter of integration and equality for black Americans, visited the campus of the Tuskegee Institute on April 19, 1941. She met with Charles Chief Anderson, director of the program at Moton Field, Tuskegee, Alabama. During the course of her evaluation of the facilities, she asked Anderson, "Can Negroes really fly airplanes?" Without hesitation, he replied, "Certainly we can," and offered her an airplane ride, which she immediately accepted. Upon completing her 30-minute flight over the campus, Eleanor announced, "I guess Negroes can fly." Charles Chief Anderson was known as the father of black aviation. He earned his nickname because he was the chief flight instructor of the Tuskegee Airmen. He was the first Tuskegee Airman to be featured on a U.S. postage stamp in 2014. On July 23, 1941, the Army Air Corps officially established the Air Corps Advanced Flying School at Tuskegee. It would later be renamed Tuskegee Army Flying School. Supporting these pilots were over 10,000 additional men and women working alongside as civilian or military flight instructors, crew chiefs, navigators, bombardiers, mechanics, munitions, nurses, cooks, and additional support crews. Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who had transferred into the Army Air Corps, became the commanding officer of the 99th Fighter Squadron in 1942. The 99th was the first flying unit for African Americans. They served with distinction in the European theater, supporting the Allied invasions of Sicily and Italy, along with missions in North Africa. Davis took command of the 332nd Fighter Group in 1943. Davis completed 60 combat missions with the 332nd Fighter Group. Davis would become the first 4-star general in the United States Air Force in 1998. The Tuskegee fighter pilots in the 332nd Fighter Group would be nicknamed Red Tails, or Red Tail Angels, because of the painted markings on the vertical stabilizers on the aircraft. The Red Tails flew escort missions for the B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers, protecting them from German fighter planes. These Tuskegee pilots had one of the lowest loss records of any escort fighter group. Many bomber crews often asked to be escorted by these Red Tails. The Germans had another nickname for these fighter pilots, the Black Birdmen. There were 996 pilots who graduated from the Tuskegee Advanced Flying School between 1941 and 1945. Among those, 352 pilots were deployed in Europe during World War II as fighter pilots. 30 pilots were downed or captured as POWs, and 84 Tuskegee Airmen would die in combat. During World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen received multiple awards and citations, including 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses. The Tuskegee Army Airfield would close on August 20th, 1946. The Tuskegee Airmen were collectively awarded the Congressional Gold Medal by President George W. Bush and the U.S. Congress on March 29, 2007. The Tuskegee experiment opened the door to integration, proving without a doubt that black men had the courage, intelligence, and character to be distinguished soldiers and patriots. Here is one of these men.
can come from nothing and still make something out of yourself. Depends on your own personality and your own drive.
John Benjamin Roach was born in Boston in 1925. He was the son of John Philip Roach and Mary Irish, both immigrants from Montserrat, West Indies, a British territory in the Caribbean. John's father, born in 1894, grew up in Cork Hill, a town north of the capital city of Plymouth. He was a British citizen, and therefore in 1916 he would join an all-black West Indies regiment in the British Army in World War I, where he would serve in Europe and the deserts of Africa. After the war, he returned to the West Indies, and there, along with his future wife, Mary Amelia Irish, they would immigrate to St. John's, New Brunswick, Canada, in March of 1920, and then to the United States. Mary would stay with her brother, who lived in Roxbury, while John went to New York to find work. John and Mary would be married in November of 1920 in Boston. In the 1930s, John and Mary immersed themselves into the Boston community. The Roach family would often go to Franklin Field to watch their father play cricket on the local West Indies team, sometimes for many hours. The Roach family home was in the south end of Boston on Florence Street, where the neighborhoods were made up of many nationalities and cultures. It was there that the 5 Roach children, Francis, Alicia, James, John Benjamin, and Peter, would grow up. And it was there that their son John early on develops a passion for airplanes.
From what my mother tells me, ever since I was in the baby carriage, I used to point up at airplanes. We were living in the south end of Boston, which was within the traffic pattern of Logan Airport at that time. So every time an airplane went by, I used to point at it simply because of the noise.
When he was 7 or 8 years old, there were other kids like him who were interested in airplanes. They realized that you could go to East Boston Airport by going to Rose Wharf and take the ferry.
Once I had 4 cents, 2 cents to go across and 2 cents to come back, then I would go across on the ferry, hang on the fence at Logan Airport and watch the airplanes take off and land for about 3 or 4 hours.
It was John's first experience with aircraft. He would say at that time, "Somehow, I'm going to fly airplanes." As a teen, he would spend hours at the Boston Public Library learning all he could about airplanes and aerodynamics. Growing up in a multiracial neighborhood, kids got to know each other, and they learned that they had to take people as they are in order to get along. John would realize later that this life lesson did him a great service when he went into the military. Coming from his neighborhood, he would say, he learned how to handle things without getting hostile. John has commented that his father was his idol. He remarked how his father came from another country, didn't have a great job, and was a janitor his entire life. He told John and his siblings, "You can't fight your way to the top with your fists. You can with your character." An important lesson the Roach children would learn from their parents. John's older brother, James Philip Roach, would fall back on this same advice when he enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1942. It's important to mention before continuing that there was another military roadblock for African American patriots during World War II. James Philip Roach was one of the first black Marine recruits trained at the all-black Montford Point boot camp in North Carolina. The Marine Corps was segregated during World War II, and these black recruits would have separate training facilities in the westernmost point of Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. The black Marines had as bad a time in North Carolina communities as the Tuskegee Airmen did in Alabama. They were segregated from the white Marines. They were not allowed to enter Camp Lejeune without being accompanied by a white Marine, but they persevered. The largest number of black Marines during World War II served in the 51st and 52nd Defense Battalions, in the ammunitions and depot companies. Here, approximately 2,000 black Marines saw action in the battles of Saipan, Iwo Jima, Guam, and Okinawa. The original Montford Point Marines were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal in 2011 in recognition of their personal sacrifice and service during World War II. John was attending Mechanical Arts High School in Boston when World War II started. He would make sure that he kept up with current events as the war progressed, and one way he did this was through the newspapers.
There was a barber shop on Albion Street in the south end of Boston, and every Saturday morning they used to get the Afro-American newspaper, and they would carry a special section on black pilots who were learning to fly down at Tuskegee. And I followed this religiously every Saturday morning. I'd go into the barber shop, sit down, read the paper. The barber never bothered me at all.
Upon graduation in 1943, John didn't wait to be drafted. He volunteered, and his only interest was to fly. 6 months after he turned 17, he gathered his birth certificate, diploma, and a letter from his parents giving him permission to enlist. He headed to the nearest recruiting station in Boston to enlist in the Army Air Force. At the first recruiting station, he was told by the sergeant that the Army Air Corps was not accepting black recruits, but he could sign up for the infantry. He would be turned down by 9 other recruiting officers, but John was persistent. His determination was rewarded at the 10th and possibly last recruiting station in Boston. The recruiter knew of the Tuskegee Airmen and processed his papers, scheduled his physical exams and tests at Fort Devens in Ayer, Massachusetts. He said goodbye to his family, and 2 days later, John boarded a train at South Station, heading south for basic training. The train stopped at Union Station in Washington, D.C., where the conductor and a policeman entered the train and scanned each car and noticed the young black soldier. They asked him, "What are you doing here?" He had no idea what they were talking about. He told them he just enlisted in the Air Force and was headed to pilot training. He was immediately forced from his seat. Then they ushered him to the first car behind the coal car, the least comfortable car on the train, because that's where the African Americans were. This is where you ride. It was the only place black Americans could sit when traveling through the South on a train. Upon John's arrival at Keesler Airfield in Biloxi, Mississippi for his pre-aviation training, he remembers,
I had been reading a lot about airplanes, Boston Public Library, and wherever I could get my hands on airplanes. So when I arrived at Keesler Field, I was familiar with the names, locations, parts, and pieces of an airplane. The only thing is I had never touched one.
John arrived at Tuskegee Airfield in Alabama to begin training to fly in October of 1944. He soon felt that the segregation and prejudice he had experienced earlier was not as prevalent for the African American soldiers at Tuskegee. John found that the white instructors were very cooperative, and one of his instructors was from Needham, Massachusetts. The instructor told the trainees that there is no color barrier. "We're talking about instructor to trainee, and that's it." That's all he cared about, he told them. "Fly the plane, and you've got it made."
The thing that struck me the most when I started flying was, why did they restrict the black people from flying airplanes? There was nothing on the airplane, nothing in the airplane that had to do with the color of your skin. No airplane that I have ever flown ever refused to obey my commands simply because my skin was black.
At the time of John's arrival, Tuskegee fighter training had expanded to include short-range bombers. In this phase, instructors take a look at the pilots. Roach characterized the allotment of pilots for fighter or bomber assignments by the instructors as follows. "Well, John Roach over there is 6'1" and 175 pounds. He's going to be a bomber pilot. Now, Henry Jones over there is 5'3", about 115 pounds. He's going to be a fighter pilot." The scientific reasoning was based on size of the airman, cockpit space, and weight of the plane. While odd, the assignment was strangely efficient since each of the airmen was proficient in flying both planes. The B-25 bomber was a heavily armed aircraft in the war. It could carry a 3,000-pound bomb load and had a crew of 4 to 6 men. While John was still in training on bombers, other Tuskegee pilots were flying missions in Nazi-occupied Germany.
A lot of the units that were already over there, if they were attacked by German fighters, they would leave the bombers and go and try to destroy the German fighters and become aces or try to drive the planes away. And as they chased those Germans, other Germans would come in and shoot down a lot of the bombers. They were losing 50 and 60 bombers on some of those missions. Colonel Davis said, as long as we're escorting those bombers, we will not leave them. We'll drive the enemy off and come back. Drive them off and then come back. So we never had an ace in the Tuskegee Airmen. However, with all those missions, over 200 missions, the 332nd Fighter Group and the 99th Fighter Squadron never lost a bomber to an enemy fighter.
Roach's B-25 bomber group graduated on August 4, 1945, a few days before World War II ended with the atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. John began his training at Tuskegee in September of 1944 and would graduate on August 4, 1945. John's original compound at Tuskegee had 900 applicants, and when they were finished testing and training, they would only be 85. Of the 85 trainees, only 35 passed, sending 50 trainees to infantry. More than likely, it wasn't because they weren't good pilots, but the War Department had a quota on the number of black pilots they would allow into the Army Air Corps. Roach would be one of the 35. He graduated from the Tuskegee B-25 training in the class of 1945E and was then sent to Godman Field in Kentucky to the 477th Bomb Group, commanded by Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. They were preparing for deployment in the Pacific Theater. While en route to Godman Field, another bomber, the B-29 Enola Gay, dropped the first atomic bomb on August 6, 1945, on the city of Hiroshima, Japan, ushering in the close of the war. When Japan surrendered, Roach remembered how disappointed the new young bomber pilots were. They believed their training was wasted and the opportunity to defend the country with at least one mission was missed. As Roach noted, he was a very disappointed 20-year-old at that time. After the war, things would start to change in the military.
Right after Roosevelt died, Truman took over and he realized we had two separate air forces, one black and one white, spending twice as much money. Flying suits that were made for flyers, if they were coming to the Tuskegee Airmen, had a certain part number. If they were going to a white outfit, they had a certain part number. Same flying suit. So when Harry saw that, he said, enough of this. He did away with segregation. At least from my experience, nothing could have worked better.
At the end of World War II, President Truman made the statement regarding desegregating the armed forces. This is ridiculous. Everybody goes with everybody else, and that's the end of that. On July 26, 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, banning segregation based on race in the armed forces. It would be the first time the U.S. military would be integrated since the Revolutionary War. Roach, now at Godman Field awaiting another assignment, joined other squadron pilots, including Daniel Chappie James, another bomber pilot who would transfer to the fighter unit. A venerated pilot, James dedicated his life to an extraordinary career in the U.S. Air Force. Over the course of 3 wars, he completed more than 160 combat missions as a fighter pilot. Like Roach, he piloted both bombers and fighters. He was the first African American in America's armed forces to attain the rank of 4-star general. While Roach's combat training was not put to use in World War II, he decided to stay in the military by continuing in the Air Force Reserves. He returned to his home in the South End in 1946. Now separated from active duty, he went to Boston University College of Industrial Technology. He would meet his wife, Ethel May Carr. They were married in Boston on September 9, 1950. The couple moved to Woburn in 1965 with their daughters Lorraine and Carolyn Roach. He was called back during the Korean conflict and served with the 89th Airlift Wing, flying transport missions out of Hanscom Air Force Base in Bedford, Massachusetts. Roach was the first and for a while the only black pilot stationed at Hanscom. He had a long career as a pilot and aircraft technician at Hanscom. In 1966, he was promoted to Deputy Group Commander of a C-124 transport group that was recalled during Vietnam. One of his most memorable assignments was delivering a new aircraft control tower, fully assembled, from Bedford, Massachusetts to Saigon.
The airplane we used was a C-124. They slid it into the airplane, closed the front doors. We took off and flew into Saigon while the airport was under fire, enemy fire. I remember my navigator saying, "We better get the heck out of here before these guys learn to shoot." And the people were shooting all around the place, but there were no bullet holes in the airplane. I guess it was just an act of God that we didn't get hit. My concern was to get the airplane on the ground. If you're going to get hit, you're going to get hit. If you're not, you're not. There's no way you can see the bullet coming and try to dodge it, so there's no point in worrying about it.
In 1969, John Roach worked for the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, as an air carrier operations inspector at Logan Airport. In 1974, he became chief of the Boston office. After 2 years, he was promoted to general aviation and air carrier chief at the regional headquarters, overseeing all field offices and flight standards. Eventually, Roach was promoted to deputy regional director of all FAA facilities in New England. He would often speak to students and tell them, "At 7 years old, I was hanging on the fence at that airport. I couldn't even get in that airport. Now I'm in the office in that airport that can shut down an airline if it's warranted." John Roach retired from the FAA in 1983, and after serving in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, he retired from the United States Air Force as a full colonel in 1985. During his career, John had logged over 5,500 hours of flight time and had flown 45 different aircraft.
I tell this to the kids in school. You must learn to live with people. If people won't accept you, then you proceed about your business and let them worry about that. Every time I go to bed at night, I say, thank God for meeting the people that I did, white or black.
John Roach died on April 27, 2005, at the age of 79. John Roach was an intelligent, eloquent, and dignified man, and exemplified the best of being a Tuskegee Airman, and an example for other young black men and women to emulate. While facing racism at many turns in his life, his character and determination to succeed contributed to the advancement of equal opportunity in the military and in life for future generations. Like other small cities and towns throughout America, Woburn responded to the call for action during World War II. Families were disrupted as fathers, sons, and daughters went off to war. The large extended Ferrullo family of North Woburn was no different. All 4 sons of Ralph and Mary Ferrullo entered the war at various times and served their country with great pride and patriotism. John M. Jackie Ferrullo served in the Army Air Corps and was killed in action over Sardinia, Italy on July 3, 1944. Woburn has honored Jackie by naming Ferrullo Field in North Woburn in his memory. But there is another member of the Ferrullo family, a cousin, who also served his country with great honor. Many of his contributions remained untold and are buried away in top-secret files. But what is known is remarkable and noteworthy as any that can be told. He would be one of the nation's top security and intelligence experts during and after the war. Major William L. Bud Uanna was born on May 13, 1909 in Medford, Massachusetts. He was the son of Antonio Tony Uanna and Teresa Ferrullo. His father was an Italian immigrant born in Naples, Italy, arriving in New York City in 1894. He worked as a laborer most of his life, including at Boston Navy Yard during the war. His mother, Teresa Ferrullo, was born in Boston and raised on Richmond Avenue in Woburn, and it was in Woburn they would marry in 1905. After graduating from Medford High School in 1929, Bud attended Tufts University, and graduated in 1933, receiving a degree in civil engineering. Later, in 1934, he returned to Tufts to earn his Master of Arts in Education. A man documented for having the intelligence of a genius and various passions, he decided to pursue a degree in law from Suffolk University, where he often saw his cousin Louis Ferrullo, also studying there. He passed the Massachusetts State Bar examination and later would be admitted to the federal bar. In 1940, while still in law school, he worked as a civil engineer for the city of Medford, and later for the Army Corps of Engineers. At this same time, the military draft was in effect. Rather than wait to be drafted, he enlisted in May of 1941. War would be declared in December. Uanna's career path in the military advanced very quickly. He entered the Army as a private in 1941 and 6 years later was discharged from active duty in 1947. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel. During these 6 years in the military, his accomplishments and contributions during the war were remarkable to say the least. He first attended military intelligence school at the Army War College in Washington, D.C., and graduated as a special agent in military intelligence. He performed intelligence duties related to top-secret programs. He would then graduate from Officers Candidate School, Corps of Engineers. In 1941 to 1942, Bud would be reassigned as an investigator and later as Director of Investigations, 1st Service Command, Central Intelligence Army, Boston. He was responsible for supervising over 300 military intelligence agents and would become commander of the 10th Army Corps, in charge of counterintelligence activities for 5 field divisions. In 1943, he transferred to the War Department Military Intelligence College in Chicago as an instructor in fingerprinting, telephone monitoring, demolitions, camouflage, just to name a few. In this position, he composed a manual for the military encompassing the many phases of physical security and port security to be delivered to all intelligence units. In the later part of 1943, he would be one of 6 instructors selected by the War Department to be assigned to the Manhattan Engineer District. In 1939, scientist Albert Einstein fled Nazi Germany, and physicist Enrico Fermi fled fascist Italy, both coming to the United States to join prestigious positions at major universities. From the beginning, they warned the American government of Germany's experiments splitting atoms to produce a bomb of mass destruction. Einstein penned a personal letter to President Roosevelt outlining his concerns. The Manhattan Project was a military project. The goal was to produce an atomic bomb, a new military weapon. Roosevelt would set up a top policy group for this program, but as it became larger, the responsibility would fall on the Army Corps of Engineers. The MED, or Manhattan Engineer District, was then established to oversee this newly created atomic bomb project. This group would be charged with administering contracts, maintaining security, and overseeing the work. The MED organization then set up the CIC, Counterintelligence Corps. Security was critical in the Manhattan Project because the Army was aware of the German research and the tremendous military potential the atomic bomb would give to whoever possessed it. The site selected to carry out this project was Oak Ridge, Tennessee, officially known as the Clinton Engineer Works. It would be the home of the Manhattan Project's uranium enrichment production facility. In August of 1944, Uanna was appointed the Intelligence and Security Officer for the Clinton Engineer Works at Oak Ridge with all security responsibilities. This facility would employ over 80,000 workers by 1945. In February of 1945, Uanna would be assigned to the Office of the Secretary of War and become the security officer for the 509th Composite Group, part of the Army Air Force that would drop the atomic bombs on Japan. This facility, that was responsible for putting the pieces together, was located in Los Alamos, New Mexico, in an isolated area encompassing 54,000 acres in the northern part of the state. J. Robert Oppenheimer, a physicist from the University of California at Berkeley, would be the director of Project Y, this new secret laboratory. At the same time, Uanna would be in charge of the 1st Technical Service Detachment, responsible for security operations involving the atomic weapons. Life was not normal for these scientists. Work and free time were strictly controlled. They were not allowed contact with their relatives, nor could they travel more than 100 miles from the Los Alamos area. Shortly after, Bud arrived at the Pacific island of Tinian, which was being occupied by the 509th. His job was to supervise all physical security layouts for the planes, equipment, shop, and laboratory areas where the atomic weapons were assembled and loaded. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay, captained by Paul Tibbets, left the runway on Tinian Island and dropped the first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. Three days later, a second B-29 bomber left Tinian, captained by Charles Sweeney, who dropped another atomic bomb on Nagasaki. In September of 1945, Uanna spent 4 weeks in Nagasaki preparing a bomb blast study left behind in the wake of the attack. This information was safeguarded from foreign governments. In 1946, Uanna returned to Washington, D.C. It was then that President Truman had just signed the Atomic Energy Act, creating the Atomic Energy Commission. Uanna was selected by the military to establish a personnel clearance program for the commission. Although discharged from the Army in 1947 as a lieutenant colonel, he remained with the commission as the chief of personnel clearance section. He developed the standards, criteria, and procedures, AEC employment regulations, that are still in effect today. Uanna also named and established the Q clearance and criteria. In 1949, he was named administrative officer at the newly created Central Intelligence Agency. He wrote the briefing manual for the OPC, Office of Policy Coordination. The OPC was the covert action branch of the intelligence community. He left the agency in 1951. He would then work with the National Security Council, the board responsible for developing security programs for government and industry. By 1953, he was working for the State Department, reorganizing the foreign physical security branches into a single operation, and he was named its new chief. His responsibilities included security of all State Department personnel and facilities throughout the world. This included Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and all visiting dignitaries such as Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip in 1957. In November 1958, Uanna was posted overseas in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. He would return briefly to the United States in 1959 to oversee the security for the visit of Nikita Khrushchev. While on assignment in the office of the air attaché at the United States Embassy in Ethiopia, it was reported that William Bud Uanna died of a heart attack on December 22, 1961. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. He was survived by his wife, Bonnie Louise Leonard, whom he married in 1947, and their son, Stephen Lee Uanna, born in 1954. Fitting a story of a man whose life was filled with secrecy and intrigue, the movie Above and Beyond, starring Robert Taylor and James Whitmore, was made in 1952. It portrays the undisclosed activities of the 509th Composite Group. Whitmore played the part of Major William Uanna with Bud's approval. William Bud Uanna dedicated his life as an educator, engineer, lawyer, soldier, and national security expert. Bud was a patriot who truly went above and beyond.